I'd like to welcome you today to today's webinar entitled Meeting Dairy Heifer Nutrition Goals. We asked Bob James from Virginia Tech Dairy Science Department to actually talk about this particular topic. He is the Dairy Extension Project Leader there at Virginia Tech with some additional responsibilities in teaching and research. His research over the years has focused on management of growing calves and heifers. There actually was a Jersey milk replacer that was developed based on the research that he did over his career. His current research involves studying the management factors which are influence the use of computerized calf feeders and management strategies for the use of on-farm pasteurizers for treatment of waste milk for calves. He is also a founding member of the Dairy Calf and Heifer Association and served as its conference chairperson several times. Bob has made presentations throughout the U.S. and has consulted with calf ranches, dairies, and feed companies throughout the U.S., and he looks forward to doing that in his retirement. With that, Bob, I open the floor for you.
It's a real pleasure to be here today to talk about something I'm very passionate about, and that's raising dairy heifers. One of the things I do want to bring to bear is that this is not a very provincial webinar, in that we're dealing with a lot of different situations, so we're going to focus on some of the really key things that I think are important. And I think we want to start off with really some goals, and that is one that's a little bit different I want you to think about, and that's we want to optimize net profit, and that means looking at the relationship between rearing costs and ultimately lifetime performance. It's how much money is left over. I think a lot of times we think about how inexpensively we can get it done, and that really might impair some of the lifetime performance of that animal. And this is really an interrelationship of the feed resources that one has, the facilities, the labor, and the management, and this varies tremendously as we go across the country. Our key focus areas are going to be a little bit on the dry cow. Again, we're going to talk a bit about colostrum, probably more on pre-weaning nutrition and a little bit on weaning management, and then how do we feed and manage that post-weaning animal. For the dry cow, ultimately she needs to finish up her lactation and good body condition score somewhere around a 3.25 to 3.5, and we need to pay attention to details. Qualitatively, nutrition is important. One of the places where I see a downfall is that we don't pay enough attention to vitamin and trace mineral nutrition to these cows. It's a very small part quantitatively, but qualitatively it is really very, very important for that cow and also her developing calf. With rumen health, we like to feed some bulky diets. They should be free of molds, and ultimately I think one of our goals is that we want to have that cow really ready to consume a lot of dry matter after calving. Our goal here is really the production of some good quality colostrum and easy calving. So if we start out with colostrum management, I know this is almost like beating a dead horse for some folks. We look at the quality, and that's having a high IgG content or antibody content per liter of about 50 grams. We can do that by testing either with a refractometer or with a colostrometer. And the other quality mention that I want to bring to bear is that it needs to be low in bacteria count. We'll see how this plays out in just a little bit. We want to feed quantity, and largely that means having 4 liters of that and delivered as soon as possible as we can to that calf after birth. The points to emphasize here, we don't get any second chances. And what we do with this calf in that first 6 to 24 hours has a tremendous bearing upon lifetime performance of that animal. Now, the reason why cleanliness is important, I've got the 2 pictures here. On the right, over here, we have a picture of a pretty nasty looking calving environment, really with a lot of bacteria present there. Now, the reason that bacteria are important is that excessive early intake of bacteria, particularly coliforms, from colostrum or from a dirty calving area environment, reduces IgG absorption or antibody absorption in that small intestine. If we look at right in here we have some bacteria, and they're actually being absorbed by that intestinal epithelial cell. And what that does is to really hinder antibody absorption by that calf. So dirty calving environment, high bacteria colostrum because it was too warm for too long or placed into a dirty bucket can really hinder that antibody absorption for that calf. And that's so important. To see the impact of this, there's a study, a nice little simple study done at University of Illinois, and we had two different feeding programs, a conventional feeding program where we had 1¼ pounds of a 2220 calf milk replacer fed per day, or a more intensive program where we started out at 1¾ went up as high as 2½ pounds of a 2820 milk replacer per day. Now, we had poor and good quality colostrum management on these farms. I do want to make a correction here. This is 1,000 milligrams per deciliter, and that should be of colostrum. So about 20 calves per treatment, and we look at the calves with poor IgG or poor antibody absorption versus those that were good in both the conventional and the intensive, and we can see that the difference that made to average daily gains, particularly on the intensive situation. When we had poor antibodies, we had very poor performance by those calves. There's some other benefits, and these are a little bit more subtle, but if we look at the situation when we had some studies conducted, we see improved glucose absorption. We have better development of the intestinal epithelial cells in these calves that have been fed adequate amounts of colostrum. And one of the things that has just been studied here at Virginia Tech, not only do we have antibodies in that colostrum, but there are also white blood cells or immune cells that are absorbed. And in an ideal situation, if we can feed that calf fresh colostrum from its dam, we see a better immune response a little bit later on in life. Now, what's the priority here? I think the priority is really getting high antibodies in there, and we're not always able to feed fresh colostrum to that calf due to labor management constraints that we might have on the farm. But if we can do that, we're seeing some real positive benefits of feeding that fresh colostrum. Now we're going to make the assumption that we've done a really good job with colostrum management, and now we're feeding that young calf, that pre-weaned calf. I want to change our mindset here. Historically, we have fed calves with an ambition of trying to wean them as soon as we possibly can. And that means feeding limited amounts of milk so that they're really encouraged to eat dry feed. Now I want to change that mindset. And we're going to feed calves to meet their nutrient requirements for maintenance and also for gain. I also want to bring up the point that this calf's behavior and diet differ greatly during the first couple of weeks of life. In that first couple of weeks of life, that calf is not going to eat calf starter, regardless of what our feeding program is. And we must remember that this is an animal that really depends upon consumption of milk. Now, if we look at maintenance requirements, and that's the amount of energy or protein that it takes just to maintain that animal's body weight without growing a bit. Now, are maintenance requirements for these two calves the same? I don't think so. In fact, this calf over here on the right actually has a heating pad underneath that nice bed of straw. So it can since the maintenance requirements are lower, divert a lot more energy and protein towards growth rather than just trying to maintain body weight such as we have with this calf. The other thing to be very cognizant of is we're going to talk about critical temperatures for calves. And there's a lower critical temperature and an upper one. We want to really look at this lower critical one here. And this is the effective environmental temperature where animals must expend energy to maintain body temperature. The thing that's really interesting is that this calf less than 21 days of age, that lower critical temperature is 59 degrees, which means, like, I don't know where you are, but here in Virginia this morning, it was 45 degrees. So that animal is going to divert more energy this morning just to maintaining its body weight. Now, when they get a little bit older, that lower critical temperature drops down to about 42 degrees. If we look at energy allowable gain, again, emphasizing this thing on nutrition, we're going to compare whole milk, which on a dry basis, which would be about 26% protein and 28 to 30% fat, to a pretty much traditional 20/20 milk replacer. We have whole milk here, 20/20 milk replacer. We're going to start off with an 80-pound calf. This is in week 1. We're going to feed 4 quarts a day, which is about a pound of dry matter in that liquid. Well, we have enough energy at 68 degrees with feeding whole milk to have about 0.85 pounds of gain a day. Temperature drops to 32. We only have enough energy to support 0.19. With the 20/20, again at 68 degrees, enough for 0.64. At 32 degrees, that calf is losing body weight. If we up that milk intake or milk replacer intake from 1 to 1.5 pounds, or about 6 quarts, the point I want to emphasize is now we have enough energy to support growth on that calf even at 32 degrees. Now think about some additional challenges. What if the temperature is less than 32? What if we have very poor bedding? This is going to have an impact again about what kind of gain we're able to support with those diets. My message here is that we have to feed calves more milk solids than we have in the past. What about some additional challenges with that calf? A lot of folks like to train calves to drink from a bucket. Well, what do we do when that calf doesn't like to drink from a bucket? Well, maybe we just let them wait until the next feeding. Well, at cold weather, that could present some real metabolic challenges to that animal. We also tend to feed animals when it's convenient for our schedule. Generally, maybe 8 o'clock in the morning, 4 or 5 o'clock in the afternoon, and that's really not very biologically normal. And our challenge is here, when we only feed 4 quarts a day, generally they won't have any trouble eating both of those allocations, or 2 quarts in the morning or 2 quarts in the afternoon. But think about this calf long about 2 o'clock in the morning that now has metabolized all that milk that it consumed in the evening feeding, and it's going to start breaking down some protein. The message is they're under some real metabolic stress. Now, if we up that, let's say to 6 or even 8 quarts a day, a lot of times our calves will consume that morning meal, but they won't the afternoon meal because it was a shorter interval. And we really have a hard time on twice-a-day feeding getting enough energy and enough protein into those calves. The other one is how we feed calves. Well, one of the nice things, buckets hold more than bottles. And I think we're seeing a transition in the industry of moving away from 2-quart bottles, if that's the mode of feeding, to 3-quart bottles, which lets us get more solids into those calves. In fact, we do have manufacturers now that are selling 4-quart bottles for calves to get that. The other point I want to make is the challenge of buckets. And I think that's classically shown right here, in that calf, being a very, very aggressive Jersey eater, has just dumped a good bit of that feed out on the ground. And we really need to think about our feeding management and getting energy and protein into those calves. Now, my final message about energy content of milk and milk replacer and getting more solids, we're going to do a comparison of whole milk, 26% protein and 31% fat on a powder basis, to a 26/20 milk replacer. This diet will have about 2.4 megacalories of metabolizable energy per pound of dry matter. The 26/20 will have about 2.2. So a 90-pound calf at 68 degrees requires about 1.62 megacalories of metabolizable energy. That can be met by about 0.7 to 0.7 pounds of milk or milk replacer. Now, if that temperature drops to 20 degrees, I now need to feed 1.2 to 1.3, or about 10 pounds, just to meet maintenance requirements, and that's really not providing any gain. Again, my message, we have to feed more milk solids to our calves to really assure, particularly at early life, that particularly the 2nd and 3rd week, that we're getting energy and protein intake. And I show my picture of a Jersey calf. I'm partial to Jerseys, but when they're fed right, they have the body condition that I like to see on this 4 or 5 week old Jersey calf. So another way to get milk solids, and that's to increase the feeding frequency. And this is a neat little study done at Wisconsin, compared 3 times a day versus twice a day feeding. We fed the same amount of feed per day, but just fed either 3 times or twice a day at these rates for these ages. Now I apologize, this is in kilograms, but we'll do some conversion here. Now if we look at body weight gain, we had almost 5 kilos more gain, or 10 pounds more gain over 42 days. They grew a little bit less than 2 centimeters, almost an inch more, and they had higher feed efficiency, or more gain per unit of dry matter intake. Same feed, just increasing frequency. On this study, they weaned 2 more heifers, and they had 6 more animals enter into the lactating herd. That's big dollars. That's big dollars on a farm. Age at first calving was not different, and even though there was a 500 kilogram difference in milk production, or about 1,000 pounds, that was not statistically different, what we would consider statistically different. So there are some real responses to more frequent feeding of calves. Now, again, that's not 3 times a day feeding between 8 and 5 o'clock. That's looking at a nighttime feeding. So if we look at some of our other calf feeding challenges, getting nutrients in, that's the amount of solids and its consistency that I want to emphasize here. I highly encourage weighing powder and water so that the solids level in that milk replacer, if that's what's being fed, is the same day after day. The other one is measuring temperature. Having a thermometer there in the calf feeding room where we're mixing milk or milk replacer to record that temperature. We want it somewhere between 101 and 105 when we're feeding those calves. If it's cold, we're going to increase the maintenance requirements for those calves. I want an environment that's optimized to reduce maintenance expenses. That might be calf jackets in the winter. It definitely means dry. The other one is when weather's bad, we have to adjust our feeding for environmental changes. We may need to feed solids up to 15% dry matter. We may need to provide an extra feeding during cold weather. Now, I know it's real easy for me to say these things because I'm sitting here in a university environment, but I have fed my own calves and had my own calves at home. Let's look at feeding more milk successfully from the calf's perspective. Well, higher intake without contributing to digestive upsets, smaller, more frequent meals are going to be a real positive. Now, what about the person that's feeding calves? Well, I don't want to be feeding calves all day long. And it's real nice to say go out there and do a nighttime feeding at 9 or 10 o'clock, but if you're the one doing it, that's not very pleasant. The other challenge or compromise that we have is from an owner's perspective, I want it to be affordable and I want to see a return on our investment. I think some of the real exciting things that we're seeing now is that some of these higher feeding rates, we are seeing returns on investment. If I have 6 more animals freshening a year from a more intensive feeding program, that's big dollars that can really justify that. So how do we get more solids? Well, mob feeders are one way, and we're not going to talk about pluses or minuses of each system. They do have them. In the Northeast, we see a lot of places where they're feeding acidified free choice, and we also have the automatic calf feeders. Then again, I'll make a disclaimer here. There are a lot of good automatic calf feeders there on the market. This just happens to be one of those in a facility here near to Blacksburg. This is and I am a little bit, and I'm going to give a commercial for Marcia's webinar the next webinar, because there are some awfully exciting things about feeding calves with the automatic feeders. This is the feeding plan that we have, and one of the neat things, I can control daily allocation, and what I've done here is it's relatively stable for the first couple of days. Here's the amount of feed, and here's the age of that calf, and really the age plus whatever the age was that they started. So we start them off relatively small, and these bars indicate how much that calf ate every day on their own. So we can bring that calf up gradually and then we can also wean that calf gradually. We can let this machine control the daily allocation. We can let it control the maximum and minimum meal sizes and really facilitate more gradual and maybe a little bit less stressful weaning. And we also have a record of intake. I look at this calf right here and wow, why did it drop from almost 7 liters a day to 2? And maybe that was a harbinger that that calf had a disease problem. So we can have some very, very valuable management information. So if we look at successful calf management, colostrum, environment, feeding enough solids, and that's a challenge of higher volume with 2X. There are labor challenges with 3X, but we do have some neat groups housing alternatives. And we want to have some records to evaluate management. So what about weaning? I think our traditional feeding programs where we limit fed really encouraged animals to eat dry feed sooner, but is that biologically normal? Versus the intensive programs where we have 2 pounds of dry matter intake. Now, what this does is it does delay starter intake. My question is this a problem? When we look at weaning transitions that we have dietary and behavioral ones. We're going from highly digestible liquid feeds to grains and forages, and we know we've got to get fermentation of those grains to produce some butyric acid to stimulate rumen development. The other one is behavioral. Now, if we have group-fed calves, they really make that adjustment on weaning much easier than those where we fed them individually and now they grow into group housing situation. And we probably like to delay that for several weeks after weaning if they've been previously individually housed. The other challenges that we have in weaning is this is a period where I'll acknowledge we have a high susceptibility to respiratory disease. So we want to minimize the non-nutritional and nutritional stressors. I like to restrict movement from individual to group pens until a couple of weeks after weaning, or I want to restrict movement to a new group of calves during that period of time. In other words, we would keep them in a weaning pen for several weeks and then move them into another one. Every time we make that move, it's a stress. The other one to emphasize is we really have to have probably some of our best environmental situations on the farm with good ventilation and excellent moisture control for the pre-weaned and for those calves immediately post-weaning. Now, what about weaning management and nutrition? The rate of liquid feeding really has a big influence. So if I limit feed calves, they're going to be much more aggressive eaters of dry feed than those fed higher levels of milk solids. But what about the quality of the milk replacer or whole milk that's used? Really sets that calf up to what kind of health that they have. And there are many things that are related to the calf starter we'll talk briefly about that really influence how well these calves move into weaning. We can talk about forages and also facilities. So the main focus areas, I want to maintain dry matter intake. I want a palatable, nutrient-rich calf starter grain. That means about 18 to 22% protein. I want to have some fermentable carbohydrates, about 5% molasses, somewhere between 25 to 35% starch. And particle size is not real important. Probably coarse ground or even whole corn can be very successful. The starch source in order of desirability would be corn, wheat, oats, and barley, and largely we see corn and oats being our main sources. We really don't want much added fat in here, and there'll be about 2 to 3%, 2.5 to 3% in a normal diet without any added fat, because fat does not support fermentation. Now, forage fiber is not needed for papillae growth, but some clean, digestible fiber, some chopped early maturity grass hay or small grain hay at about 15% of that starter pellet or starter can really be very positive. That protein source needs to be degradable, so it supports rumen microbe needs, and largely that's going to be something along the lines of soybean meal as our classic one there. To show you the impact of liquid feeding on weaning, I got 2 situations here, a 28-20, an intensive program versus the 20-20. They weaned the calves at 48 to 52 days. They harvested these calves to look at rumen development at 4, 8, and 12 weeks. the point I want to make, and I think this shows very well, here's our conventional feeding program with about a pound of powder a day. Here's the more intensive one, which goes at 2 1/4. So we really delay starter intake. But look at what happens here to starter intake in this late pre-weaning period, because these calves are bigger and they have very aggressive appetites. And really, by the time these calves are weaned, we see very, very little difference in starter intake. How do we wean calves? Do we do it gradually or abrupt? This was a study done at University of British Columbia where the calves were weaned at either abruptly, just one day, or over 4 days, 10 days, or 22 days, and they were fed a high level of milk to begin with. And they really found that 4 and probably the 10-day weaning was optimal for energy intake and for body weight gain. And this is shown here. These are the calves that were fed, that were weaned abruptly. These were the calves weaned over 4 days of age, over 10 days of age, and over 22. And what we're looking at here is the total digestible energy intake, and that's got to be a compromise. Now, ideally, what's important is looking at what's the body weight gain of these calves, and we can see that those that were weaned over the 10-day period really had the best body weight gain of all those animals. That weaning was a lot less traumatic for those calves. So if we look at post-weaning, what are our goals? Well, I want a rate of growth which permits pregnancy at 12 to 14 months. I don't want them too fat, and I want a reasonable cost per unit of gain, and this is very resource-driven depending upon your feed resources where you are. I want low mortality and low morbidity. This is resource-driven. We have several grouping options, and this largely depends upon herd size and facilities. I do like to have a post-weaning group. I like to have them in there for 2 months to really make sure they adjust to a group and to new forages. And then these groupings really depend upon our animal numbers and our facilities, but a pre-breeding, breeding age, bred, and then those that are transition and moving into the milking herd. Now, the important thing here is ration formulation is based upon the available forages, but we must adjust for environmental challenges. We start with the computer, but then we have to adjust it with how heifers are actually growing. We found that confinement systems, we have about a 12 to 25% improvement in feed efficiency over those that are housed more extensively or out on pasture. Hair, coat, mud, wind, temperature have a huge impact on heifer nutrient requirements. So I really can't provide you with any set rations here. Now, one thing I would like to point out is we have a couple of options on feeding heifers. And this is largely for heifers over 8 months of age. Do we limit feed them or ad lib feed them? Limit feeding, we formulate diet to provide nutrient intakes at levels of 1.5 to 2% of their body weight. So it's not ad lib, they're going to run out of feed. Versus ad libitum, where we use a lower energy, higher fiber feeds to limit overconsumption of energy. And again, this is mostly for older heifers. With the limit feeding, we have a higher concentration of nutrients in that diet, less forage. There's a little bit higher feed efficiency, and that seems to be at a restriction of about 80 to 90% of ad lib intake, and we have less manure production, which can be attractive on a nutrient management standpoint. But if we do this, we have to have enough bunk space for everybody to eat, and you need to have metal fences and structures because these heifers have oral needs, and they will chew on wood. These are more expensive rations per pound of dry matter, but what's the overall feed cost and what's the feed efficiency? And again, that really depends upon the feed cost in your operation. Now let's compare that to ad libitum. We're going to use higher fiber feeds to prevent overconsumption. We can use some less expensive byproducts. And so we're having feed available at all times, so we need less feed bunk space. And I think this is a more normal type of feeding behavior that we like to promote. But some good examples here would be some chopped hay, maybe some byproducts such as wet brewer's grains might be involved there, but we're feeding a much higher fiber and diets that are less reliant upon things like corn grain and soybean meal. So if we look at feed management, our prepartum heifers, and now we need to look at their transition to the milking herd. I like to have them in there at least 30 days and preferably 60 days prepartum, and have them adjusted to the milking herd forages and to their new environment. Some of it's dietary, some of it's social. So if we're going to wrap things up, I see we're just about out of time. We want to base these on meeting nutrient requirements. The challenge here is we have a lot less environment influences nutrient requirements, a whole lot more so than with a lactating cow. I want to focus on the young animal because it's very high risk. We make mistakes, we have higher morbidity, and we have higher mortality. And we now know that how well we do with calves has an impact on their future performance and their livability in the herd. And it's a real interplay of our success here with nutrition and environment. Post-weaning, it depends upon what kind of feed resources that we have. And I really don't like to give any set plans, because what may happen in Arizona or California could be very different from Maine, Georgia, or Illinois. Now, I want to look at delivering nutrients on a labor-efficient manner. I don't want to be feeding heifers all day. So once I meet the requirements, how can I do this most efficiently? How can I then adjust for environmental impact on maintenance requirements? And ultimately, I need records to monitor performance and management decisions. We're seeing more dairies to weigh calves at birth, to weigh calves at weaning, to weigh calves at milestones where they are handled, such as any vaccinations during breeding, and then prepartum, so that we can really evaluate the success of our heifer management program. So really, if we look at implementing sound nutrition programs, this is combating science, what we know, but ultimately our success is in making those decisions that are going to result in the highest lifetime profitability for that animal. Well, I think we're just about out of time, and I would welcome any questions that anybody has.
With that, Bob, I got a couple questions for your discussion areas. One of the things that's often said is that first 2 to 3 months of life of that calf really determines what happens later in life. Profitability, performance, that type of thing. Do you want to comment a little bit about that? Because I think a lot of times we think of calves being very important, but not understand how important they are.
Yeah, I think that there's some really neat stuff that was done at Cornell University, both at the university, but then also at some commercial dairies, where they measured the growth of calves during that pre-weaning period and then compared that to their production as first lactation, second lactation, and they found a relationship of every pound of gain that they had pre-weaning was associated with at least 1,000 pounds more milk production in that first lactation. And so that's really pretty amazing. And we recently had at the Dairy Calf and Heifer Association had several panel members, and some panel members from larger farms, which really surprised me, that said that they are more likely now to spend more money on their calves than they ever have before, because they can see the impact that has on health of those calves and what their health costs are later on in the rearing period, but also their productivity later on. We did a study here at Virginia Tech using records from a commercial dairy and found that if a calf was treated twice for respiratory disease, it significantly shortened their herd life as cows. And I think there's some of our field experiences are showing a nice relationship between housing and nutrition and morbidity in these calves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very much the health and welfare of that animal early in life impacts it later on. We have a question from one in the audience wanted you to talk a little bit about the pros and cons of using esophageal feeder versus bottle feeding colostrum.
Yeah, thanks, Richard. We have a certain number of calves that they're just not very willing to take the bottle. And I guess my personal preference is that I like to try the bottle first, and preferably a 3-quart bottle so I don't interrupt that feeding, because they're less likely to take the bottle a little bit later on. And if they don't do that, then I'll use the esophageal feeder. Now, when you look at the research, the large field studies will show you that using the esophageal feeder and feeding 4 liters will give you the same antibody levels in the blood or in the serum as bottle feeding. Now, that's if you're feeding 4 quarts. The other thing that I'll say about that is you're putting 4 quarts into a 100-pound calf, and that's a lot. And the reason you're putting so much in there is because it's going to go into the rumen when you tube feed them, and then it's going to, by force, be forced on down further on into that digestive system of the calf. And so research says either one of them will give you adequate amounts. I think from a personal perspective, I like to try the bottle first and then the esophageal feeder. If you don't have people adequately trained on the esophageal feeder, it is possible to put that fluid into the lungs, and then you've created some real problems. But it's not a very difficult procedure to do. But the other one is that we really have to make sure that colostrum feeder is very, very clean, because we can really introduce a lot of bacteria in there if it's not cleaned properly.
If anyone else has a question, go ahead and type that in. Another question to sort of follow up on, you talked about intense or accelerated calf feeding and feeding more milk replacer. Could you talk a little bit about what type of milk replacer as far as like protein and fat content and how you would decide which one you would use?
Yeah, in fact, I've done a lot of work with both pasteurized waste milk feeding and with the milk replacers. The Jersey Blend milk replacer was based on some work that we did here at Virginia Tech. When you look at optimal rates of gain, happen somewhere about 26 to 28% protein. And quite frankly, when we look at milk on a powder basis, that's about what milk is on a powder basis. Now on fat, milk has a whole lot more fat, and it's a little bit shorter chain fatty acids than we see that are present in most of the milk replacers. And so if we feed milk, we tend to see a little bit more fat deposition in these calves. That's not a problem. I like to think of it a little bit as risk management, just the same way as we'd like to have a cow calving with a little bit more body condition. Similar to the calf, I like that calf to be carrying some more body condition when it's real young, because when it gets sick, it quits eating and its energy requirements goes up, and it's nice to have a little bit of supplemental energy there. Now the problem with, or the challenge with feeding higher levels of fat in a milk replacer is that it does discourage starter intake. So I think we're trying to work out a compromise there of meeting the energy needs of that calf and also encouraging starter intake. There are milk replacers now that in the wintertime are 20 to 25% fat, and in the summertime they drop off to 10 to 12% fat, which is probably more than adequate fat levels if you don't have too much cold stress on your calves and if you have a good environment. The other one to remember is we feed calves pounds of powder and we feed them megacalories of net energy and pounds of protein. So if you're only feeding a pound of solids a day in a milk replacer, the fat and protein levels are really not very important. The most important thing is getting higher amounts of total solids into that calf. So I'd much rather have a calf eating 2.5 pounds of 15% fat milk replacer than a pound of a 20%, because the one with a higher intake is going to get more fat into. So anyway, summarize, higher protein levels, 25, 26%, and high intake. We kind of optimize lean tissue gain. For the fat side of things, what we're looking at are the having enough grams or enough megacalories of fat intake and enough energy intake for that calf.
So would you use a 20% crude protein milk replacer for an accelerated program?
Nope, because that's not going to optimize my rate of gain there. And so we may have lower costs, but we're really not optimizing performance of that animal.
We have another question going back to colostrum and
Right.
asking a question about pasteurization of colostrum. What is the best time and temperature for that?
That's very good, and there's some really great work that was done by Dr. Sandra Godden at the University of Minnesota, and what she has found is that 60 minutes for the temperature and about 140 degrees, I think it's 140 degrees Fahrenheit for the temperature on that. So a little bit lower temperature and a little bit longer time. These work best in the batch pasteurizing systems. And so we have to make sure we have good agitation and that we do that for at least 60 minutes. So a little bit lower temperature, a little bit longer time. And if we do higher temperature, we wind up with yogurt. It'll coagulate and really be a big problem there.
And make sure you clean it out.
Yes. Cleanliness is next to godliness. I mean, you really have to keep all these surfaces clean. You're going to defeat the purpose. You want to keep everything for the calf just as clean as you would for what you do with your milking system. This is a newborn and highly susceptible to bacterial problems, and a lot of that can really be traced back to sanitation. It's so important.
Well, Bob, we thank you very much for this discussion, and I think one of the things we realize more and more is how we treat that animal the first 2 to 3 months really impacts its growth and performance later on, and I think there's a lot of changes that have come down the road, and you did a very nice job of covering those. Thank you very much, Bob.
Yeah, and if anybody wants to get in touch with me, they're more than welcome to. You can go to our Dairy Science. We have a Facebook page for the department, and we also have a web page, or look me up at the university and send me an email. It's jamesre@vt.edu. So thanks for the opportunity to talk with you today.